Imagine a small, unremarkable neighborhood bar in a suburb of Seattle. Inside, there are 10 people. They are a representative sample of the American middle class: a teacher, a plumber, a mid-level software manager, perhaps a nurse. If you were to freeze time and audit the net worth of every person in that room, counting their home equity, their 401s, Ks, their savings accounts, and subtracting their debts, the average wealth would likely hover around $100,000. It is a room of stability, but certainly not one of luxury. But then, the door opens, and Elon Musk walks in to order a beer. Suddenly, the statistical reality of that room breaks. If you were to now calculate the mean average wealth of the 11 people in that bar, every single person is now, statistically, a billionaire. The teacher is a billionaire. The plumber is a billionaire. The nurse is a billionaire. But in the real world, their lived experience hasn't changed by a single cent. They cannot buy a yacht. They cannot influence global markets. They still have a mortgage. The average has lied to you. This is the fundamental flaw of contemporary economic analysis: a fixation on the mean. The arithmetic mean is a utilitarian metric for assessing the aggregate power of an economy. It tells you how many aircraft carriers a nation can build, or how many semiconductor fabs it can subsidize. But it is a deeply flawed instrument for measuring the lived experience of the citizenry. In an era of increasing global inequality, the mean is susceptible to massive distortion by the extreme outliers at the top of the distribution curve, the ultra-high net worth individuals whose fortunes pull the average upwards, masking stagnation in the lower deciles. The 2024 UBS Global Wealth Report provided a stark illustration of this distortion. When viewing mean wealth per adult, the United States and Switzerland unsurprisingly dominate the rankings. These nations are the homes of the guys walking into the bar, the immense concentrations of capital, the tech moguls, and the dynastic banking families. Under this metric, the island of Taiwan appears prosperous, yet it still trails the massive aggregate wealth of the United States and Australia. However, the data reveals a historic shift. Even in this mean metric, Taiwan has quietly surged past its primary industrial competitors. While it trails the financial city-states of Singapore and Hong Kong, Taiwan now boasts a higher mean wealth per adult than the major economies of East Asia, surpassing both South Korea and Japan. Yet, the true divergence is not found in the average, but in the median. Shifting the lens to median wealth, the value that divides the population into two perfectly equal halves, reveals a dramatically different landscape. Data derived from that same 2024 report highlights a pivotal realignment in global prosperity. While the United States boasts a massive mean wealth driven by the top 1%, sitting at over $500,000, its median wealth sits at roughly $112,000. In contrast, Taiwan presents a phenomenon we might call the median anomaly. Despite having a lower nominal GDP per capita than the US, Taiwan's median wealth per adult stands at approximately $110,000. This figure is statistically significant for several reasons. First, it places the typical Taiwanese adult on par with the typical American in terms of net assets, a feat achieved without the benefit of the US dollar's reserve currency status or the American endowment of natural resources. Second, and perhaps more relevant to the regional context, it places Taiwan well ahead of its primary competitors. It has surged past Japan, long considered the bastion of Asian stability, by nearly 15% and maintains a distinct lead over South Korea. Even traditionally wealthy European nations like Germany lag behind Taiwan in this metric. To understand the wealth of 2024, we first have to understand the inequality gap. In economics, the ratio between the mean and the median is often used as a proxy for inequality. In the United States, that ratio is roughly 5-to-1. This reflects a society where the vast majority of wealth gains are captured by the top 1%. In Taiwan, that ratio is 2.7-to-1. This implies that the wealth generated by Taiwan's export machine is sticky. It sticks to the middle class rather than flowing exclusively to the top. But if you talk to a young person in Taipei, they won't tell you they feel rich. In fact, for the last 2 decades, Taiwanese political discourse has been haunted by the memory of the 22K curse. This references a controversial government subsidy program launched post-2008, which effectively pegged starting salaries at 22,000 new Taiwan dollars. While the nominal wage floor has since risen to nearly 28,000 new Taiwan dollars, wage growth in Taiwan remains anemic compared to the soaring cost of real estate. If you are a mid-career manager at Samsung or Hyundai in South Korea, you earn a salary significantly higher than your counterpart at a Taiwanese manufacturing firm. You likely drive a newer car, you wear a more expensive suit, but, statistically, the Taiwanese counterpart has a healthier balance sheet. This discrepancy, high assets despite low wages, is not a contradiction, but a feature of a specific economic model. It is the result of what we define as the boss culture multiplier. In Taiwan, a significant portion of household income is not derived from wages, which are suppressed, but from entrepreneurial profits, capital gains, and tax-advantaged shadow economy activity. While the Korean salaryman relies on a paycheck that is heavily taxed and eroded by high living costs, the Taiwanese boss relies on equity, dividend yields, and asset appreciation. To see where this divergence began, we have to go back to the architectural blueprints of these economies drawn in the rubble of 1945. Both Taiwan and South Korea emerged from Japanese colonization in 1945 with a shared set of advantages: high literacy rates, a familiarity with industrial bureaucracy, and a fierce anti-communist alignment that secured them massive amounts of American aid. However, as they began to industrialize in the 1960s, their governments chose two radically different paths to capitalism. In South Korea, under the authoritarian leadership of Park Chung-hee, the state pursued a strategy of unbalanced growth. The state explicitly picked winners. They selected specific industrial conglomerates, the chaebol, to spearhead modernization. Companies like Samsung, Daewoo, and LG were granted preferential low-interest loans, import protection, and massive government contracts. The logic was economies of scale. Park believed that to compete with Mitsubishi or General Electric, Korea needed companies of equal size. And it worked. It transformed South Korea into a global powerhouse in shipbuilding, automobiles, and memory chips. But it also concentrated economic power. The chaebol vacuumed up capital and talent, relegating small and medium enterprises, SMEs, to a subservient role. In the Korean model, the SME became a supply chain vassal, dependent on contracts from the giants and lacking the autonomy to export independently. The social contract was clear. The chaebol would lead the nation, and the citizen would serve as the employee. Wealth accumulation would occur at the corporate level and trickle down through wages. Across the strait, the Kuomintang, KMT government in Taiwan operated under a completely different paranoia. Having just lost mainland China to the communists, they were deeply suspicious of private capital accumulation. They feared that if private tycoons became too wealthy, they would challenge the state's political power. Consequently, while the KMT retained state control over the commanding heights of the economy, utilities, banking, steel, and petrochemicals, they left the export sector largely open to the private sector. Crucially, the government did not pick winners in the export sector to the same extent as Seoul. Instead, they fostered an environment conducive to small business. The kingdom of SMEs was born not just from policy, but from the lack of a crushing corporate monopoly. Taiwan's industrialization was driven by tens of thousands of family-owned firms producing everything from plastic toys to umbrellas, then bicycle parts, and eventually, PC motherboards. This decentralized structure meant that the profits of industrialization were distributed across thousands of balance sheets rather than dozens. When Taiwan began its export boom in the 1970s, the wealth generated was business income for hundreds of thousands of families, not just wage income for workers. This structural reality reinforced a cultural algorithm that dictates Taiwanese economic behavior to this day. There is a proverb, Ning wei ji tu, bu wei niu hu. Better to be the head of a chicken than the tail of a cow. In this framework, the cow is the large, stable corporation. The tail is the employee, fed and safe, but powerless. The chicken head is the small business owner, diminutive, perhaps exposed to the elements, but possessing agency, control, and the potential for unlimited upside. This is why Taiwan has such a high density of business owners. This is not merely subsistence entrepreneurship, it is often highly technical. A small machine shop in New Taipei City might be the exclusive global supplier of a specific high-tolerance hinge used in premium laptops. This chicken head model provides systemic resilience. During the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the difference in economic architecture became painfully clear. South Korea's economy, leveraged to the hilt and reliant on a few massive points of failure, the chaebols, collapsed. The government was forced to accept a $58 billion bailout from the IMF. Taiwan, however, navigated the crisis with relative stability. Its economy was a flotilla of small boats rather than a few supertankers. If demand for one product dropped, the agile Taiwanese SMEs, masters of guerrilla strategies, pivoted to another. They shifted from textiles to toys, then to electronics assembly, and finally to high-value semiconductors. This adaptability preserved household wealth. While Korean households saw their savings wiped out or devalued, Taiwanese households continued their slow, steady accumulation of assets. But the foundation of this equity wasn't just factories, it was dirt. The most critical divergence between the two tigers may have been the land-to-the-tiller programs of the early 1950s. While both nations underwent land reform, Taiwan's was particularly comprehensive and ruthlessly executed. Facing the threat of communist infiltration, which exploited peasant grievances, the KMT implemented a three-stage land reform. First, they capped farm rents at 37.5% of the harvest. Second, they sold government land to farmers. And third, the Land-to-the-Tiller Act of 1953 literally took land from the wealthy landlords and sold it to the people actually farming it. Here is the logistical genius of the plan. The government didn't just seize the land, they compensated the landlords with bonds in state enterprises, specifically shares in cement, paper, and mining corporations. This inadvertently turned the feudal landlord class into the new industrial capitalist class, forcing them to care about industrialization if they wanted their wealth to grow. Simultaneously, it created a massive class of small landholders out of the peasantry. This radical redistribution broke the feudal power structure. As industrialization accelerated and urbanization spread, these small plots of land, once valued merely for rice yield, became prime real estate. The appreciation of land value in Taiwan accrued to the broad population, not just a landed gentry. This created a wealth floor for the median household that simply did not exist in many other developing economies. However, there is a massive variable in the wealth equation that official statistics often miss: the shadow economy. Official GDP and wage statistics capture only the formal observed economy. In Taiwan, a substantial volume of economic activity occurs off the books. Estimates for the size of Taiwan's shadow economy vary, but credible research frequently places it between 20% and 30% of GDP. For context, the shadow economy in the United States and Japan is typically estimated at around 8 to 10%. This implies that for every $100 of recorded activity in Taiwan, there is an additional $30 circulating essentially tax-free. This night market economy is not limited to street food vendors selling oyster omelets. It permeates the service sector, construction, renovation, tutoring, and notably, independent contracting in the tech supply chain. The implications for median wealth are profound. First, tax efficiency. Income earned in the shadow economy bypasses the tax net. For a small business owner, the effective tax rate may be near zero on a significant portion of their revenue. This increases net disposable income compared to a salaried employee in Korea, where taxes are withheld at the source. Second, this cash does not disappear. It is laundered into legitimate assets. It flows into the stock market, gold, and overwhelmingly into real estate. The Taiwanese government has long recognized the scale of tax evasion inherent in a cash-based SME economy. In 1951, under the guidance of Finance Minister Jen Hsien-chun, the government introduced the Uniform Invoice Lottery, a pioneering experiment in behavioral economics. The concept was simple, yet brilliant. Turn every tax receipt into a lottery ticket. The government mandated that businesses issue standardized invoices with a unique serial number. Every 2 months, a draw is held, and holders of matching receipt numbers can win tax-free cash prizes ranging from a few dollars to nearly $300,000. This policy effectively deputized the entire population as volunteer tax auditors. Customers had a direct financial incentive to demand a receipt, forcing businesses to record the transaction. However, the shadow economy is adaptive. A common negotiation in Taiwan involves a vendor asking, "Do you want a receipt? If not, I can give you a 5% discount." For the consumer, a guaranteed 5% savings is often mathematically superior to the expected value of a lottery ticket. Thus, despite the government's ingenuity, the cash economy persists, continuing to fuel the hidden wealth of households. The primary store of wealth for the median household in East Asia is real estate. However, the financial structures underpinning the housing markets in Taiwan and Korea are radically different, leading to disparate outcomes in wealth stability. Taiwan boasts a home ownership rate of approximately 79 to 80%. This is exceptionally high by global standards. Even more significant is the quality of this equity. Due to high down payment requirements, historically 30 to 40%, and a cultural aversion to debt among the older generation, a vast number of Taiwanese homes are owned mortgage-free. Compare this to South Korea. South Korea's housing market relies on a unique institution called jeonse, or key money. In this system, a tenant does not pay monthly rent. Instead, they deposit a massive lump sum with the landlord, typically 50% to 70% of the property's market value, for a 2-year lease. The landlord invests this capital and returns the principal interest-free at the end of the lease. The tenant lives rent-free, effectively lending money to the landlord in exchange for housing services. The jeonse system introduces a hidden, systemic leverage. The tenant often takes out a bank loan to pay the deposit. This is recorded as household debt. However, the asset they buy with this debt is not the house itself, but a claim on the landlord. The landlord, meanwhile, uses that deposit to buy the house, a practice known as gap investment. This creates a fragile chain of debt. If housing prices fall, the landlord cannot refund the deposit. This is exactly what occurred in the jeonse crisis of 2023 to 2024. As interest rates rose and property values dipped, landlords became insolvent. Tenants lost their life savings. Consequently, South Korea's household debt-to-GDP ratio has surged to nearly 100% officially, but when including the shadow debt of jeonse deposits, estimates push it over 150%. Korean median wealth is thus precarious. It is heavily offset by opaque liabilities. In contrast, Taiwan's household debt-to-GDP ratio is also high, sitting at roughly 90%, surpassing even the United States. However, the nature of this liability is fundamentally different. It is comprised almost entirely of standard, regulated bank mortgages rather than fragile peer-to-peer lending. While Taiwanese households are far from debt-free, their leverage is systemic and transparent, avoiding the double leverage trap of the Korean jeonse system. The median anomaly is also a story of how households invest their savings. The behavior of Taiwanese investors contrasts sharply with the conservatism of Japan. Japanese households are famously risk-averse. Following the trauma of the 1990 bubble burst, a cash-is-king mentality took hold. Data from the Bank of Japan indicates that over 50% of Japanese household financial assets are held in cash and currency deposits. In an environment of inflation, this capital is eroding. Taiwanese households, by comparison, are aggressive yield hunters. They treat the stock market not just as a casino, but as a rental property that pays dividends. The Taiwan Stock Exchange, TAIEX, is famous for its historically high dividend yields, often averaging 3% to 4% over the last decade, significantly higher than the S&P 500 or the Kospi. While the 2024 tech rally compressed these yields slightly, the cultural preference for cash flow generating assets remains. This preference drove massive retail participation. The launch of the Yuanta Taiwan Value High Dividend ETF triggered a frenzy, raising billions of US dollars in mere days. The crown jewel of this equity exposure is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. Known domestically as the sacred mountain protecting the nation, TSMC is the engine of the TAIEX. While foreign institutional ownership of TSMC is high, the domestic ecosystem surrounding it, hundreds of listed suppliers, packaging firms, and testing houses, is heavily owned by local investors. The AI boom of 2023 to 2024, driven by demand for NVIDIA chips manufactured by TSMC, lifted the entire Taiwanese market. The home bias of Taiwanese investors paid off spectacularly as their local market became the epicenter of the global AI hardware revolution. The final piece of the anomaly is the disparity between nominal wages and purchasing power. Critics might argue that wealth on paper means little if wages are low. The average monthly regular wage in Taiwan is approximately 48,000 new Taiwan dollars, roughly 1,500 US dollars, which seems low compared to Western Europe or the US. However, Taiwan operates a low-wage, low-cost model that is surprisingly efficient for wealth preservation once housing is secured. Essential services in Taiwan are heavily subsidized or structurally cheap. High-speed home internet averages around $30 a month. A comprehensive bento meal is $3 to $4. Public transport is world-class and inexpensive. But the biggest factor is healthcare. The National Health Insurance (NHI) system provides near-universal coverage with minimal copays, eliminating the medical bankruptcy risk that plagues American households. In South Korea, the cost of living is exacerbated by the hagwon culture, the necessity of expensive private tutoring to compete in the education rat race. This creates a massive drain on household liquidity. In Taiwan, while education pressure exists, the overall burden on the median household is comparatively lower, leaving more discretionary income to be channeled into assets. The divergence of Taiwan and South Korea over the last half-century offers a profound lesson in economic architecture. South Korea chose the path of the hare, explosive, concentrated growth led by corporate giants. It built a nation of gleaming skyscrapers and global brands, but it also created a society of intense pressure, high debt, and fragile employment for the salaryman. Taiwan chose the path of the tortoise, decentralized, slower nominal growth, but resilient, broad-based asset accumulation. It encouraged a culture of ownership, of small businesses, of land, of high-yield stocks. It tolerated a shadow economy that acted as a pressure valve and a capital generator. The median anomaly of 2024 is the vindication of this decentralized model. While the world focused on the drama of the chaebols, the millions of Taiwanese shopkeepers, factory bosses, and auntie investors quietly paid off their mortgages, reinvested their dividends, and built a fortress of net worth that now surpasses the giants of Asia. As the global economy faces uncertain winds, the bosses of Taiwan, anchored by real assets and agility, appear better positioned than the salarymen of Seoul to weather the storm. The tortoise, it seems, has won the race for real wealth.